So as all of you have heard me say many, many, many times, the whole point, as far as this teaching sees it, the whole point is for there to be something practical that comes out of the seeking and what we could call the change. And that practical thing that comes out of the process, according to this teaching, is peace of mind in daily living. Now, it's very easy to turn that into something. And if we turned it into something, it in and of itself, as we think about it, having turned it into something, the point, the objective, the outcome, it would then probably become fuel for suffering. So it would then become an object that the thinking mind would consume, would use as fuel. So a conceptual object that essentially attachment would be formed around. And then that would keep the me that has to get the peace of mind, the me that is going to enjoy the peace of mind, the me that has to work hard in order to get it. And so any concept, if it is processed a certain way, is going to simultaneously keep and bring into existence, keep in existence, this psychological me, the psychological doer, the psychological entity that really doesn't exist other than as a movement of mind, a cognition outcome, and it's a cognition outcome that is uncomfortable. The experience of it is that it comes with a sense of uncomfortableness because it isn't the nature that is peace. It isn't the nature that is the absence of suffering. So that movement of mind has a qualitative sense when it arises in consciousness, a sense of being felt, experienced as uncomfortableness. And so we can say that is the small self that by its nature, is to be uncomfortable. And the absence of that small self, the absence of that movement of mind, is the absence of uncomfortableness. Now, how does this absence happen? It happens when the system has been primed sufficiently to see life. So it happens when life has been described sufficiently, repetitively enough to the mind or to the system that is interpreting what life is, described sufficiently that certain aspects are no longer included in the picture it creates of life, and therefore because certain aspects are not anymore included in the picture it creates of life, the me doer psychological entity that is part of the mind's model of life, that me no longer gets constructed with the experience of life. And an example of what I've just said is if we, for example, come to appreciate that life may in fact just be a happening, like a stream, the water in a stream flowing, not because the water has an intention to go in the direction it's going in, not because the water is making its movement happen that way, but rather because as part of the overall singularity, meaning the closed environment of, if you take it out to one of the extremes, you'd say the universe, and if you want to come in and closed environment of the Earth's atmosphere, let's say, there are forces at play that force the water to move exactly the way the water moves, given the circumstance. The circumstance means the altitude, the slope of the land, the obstacles in the way, the riverbed and what it's made of and what its shape is, the forces of gravity due to, from one perspective we could say, due to the influence of other planets, our planet relative to the sun, etc. All of these, and if we want to take another set of laws, we could say, oh, well, it actually is all governed by a set of laws on a very micro level, or we might say, actually, those laws just appear to be why things happen, but really all of it is happening because the story, the movie has been created that way. Whatever it is, who knows, a dream, whether we take a materialistic view or a esoteric point of view, either way we can maybe appreciate that the sense that we are making life happen, including our own actions, our thoughts, our words, that may be a projection onto a movement that is much less personal, much less dictated by you or I, that maybe you or I are happening and would happen anyway. And there's just an idea that says, you are the orchestrators of what it is that happens in your life, the outcomes that happen in your life, and how you act in relation to my life is your doing. So better do it well. And if you don't do it well, which means delivering pain to me, then I'm going to condemn you as the doer. And that creates this whole additional layer of attitude to life. That is where all of the suffering, all of the uncomfortableness with the other, uncomfortableness with oneself stems from. Imagine if our projection, our interpretation of life is off, is wrong. And it's on that basis that all the suffering exists. That's pretty good news, actually. Could sound like not good news. Imagine if our interpretation of life was correct, and that interpretation of life created suffering. That would be bad news. Someone would say, no, it's good news because I've got it right. I've got my interpretation of life is correct. But that would mean if a correct interpretation of life led to suffering, it would mean that's basically our lot in life. It's all that is available because, well, you might say freedom would be to become deluded. If that was the case. And then the deluded freedom, which is to essentially not see life correctly, that then might lead to some sort of reprieve from the inevitable suffering of seeing life correctly. I'm talking about a hypothetical life, because it turns out that in this situation, if we see things correctly, the suffering comes to an end. So that's why it's good news. It's at the moment, as I'm describing it, we tend to see life incorrectly, not as it really is. That creates a competition, a fight, a vulnerability, a sense of self that covers up another sense, a deeper, a more true sense of self that is free of conflict, is free of uncomfortableness. So that's why it's good news, even though we're getting it essentially wrong. And when I say getting it wrong, there's no doer getting it wrong. So it's destiny for the seeing of life through a lens that distorts, let's say. It's destiny for the lens to have been created, for the lens to have been put over our eyes, and it's destiny for the vision to be as it is. The good news is that destiny can include the dissolving of the lens, the dissolving of the distortion that happens when life is seen through this lens that is not clarity, let's say. Now, so what's my point? My point is that there is peace of mind. Now, peace of mind is not something. Peace of mind is what happens when this psychological me is dissolved by life. And then peace of mind sets in. And a way of saying I am happy, or because in this teaching, as many of you would know, happiness is not happiness through outcomes. It isn't the happiness of that we think happiness is, which is to do with good times and pleasure. In this teaching, happiness is peace of mind, and peace of mind is the absence of suffering, not something, but the absence of suffering. So we can say, I'm happy because I'm not unhappy. Bearing in mind what unhappiness really is, because we might also think that unhappiness is when, something gets taken away from me and I am displeased because there is pain. That isn't the unhappiness. The unhappiness is the guilt, the blame, the pride, the expectation, and the attachment to outcomes, which could include being displeased when something gets taken away, but not simply because the situation is painful rather than pleasurable, but because of a narrative about how this came about, how the pain was introduced, and the how essentially revolves around the idea that the other did it, or that I caused it, because if I had done things differently, then the situation would have been different. So, this talk about suffering and that it is attitudinal is very important, because unless it is highlighted, then the human experience, this involvement with outcomes, this doership mentality, basically is interwoven into the circumstantial aspects of life, and it becomes impossible to see that there are actually these two layers. And when that happens, the layer that really is problematic, which is the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome in relation to what is happening in circumstance, doesn't get seen as that, and it is experienced as if it is the circumstance that is the cause of my dissatisfaction, my discontentment with life, my discontentment with oneself and with the other, is all seen to be circumstantial. And this involvement in outcomes, this attachment to outcomes, this belief that one's happiness is to be found in circumstance, is essentially the root of the psychological self. It is the biggest misconception. And so if we could have, essentially the teaching is like a note on a piece of paper that says, if you're out in the city and you see the letter A on a board on its own, just a letter A, then know you are in the wrong place. Know you are lost. And let's say that is these cards that you get given are like the Holy Grail. They are provided to you by the person that has seen tourists go out into the city, get lost because of having a sense to move in a certain direction, which all the tourists tend to have, let's say. It is given to you by a person that has grown up in the city, knows the city, is an expert in the city, let's say. And so they give you this hint. If you are in the city and you see a letter A anywhere on a board on its own with a yellow circle, let's say, around it, then know you are in the wrong place. And so you might be in the city, walking around, enjoying yourself, feeling like, oh, I'm on track. Let's say you feel like you followed all of the directions correctly and you feel like you're on track. There's no sense that you've made a mistake or you're making a mistake or you're in the wrong place. And then you see a letter A on the board. Now, if you didn't have that card, there's nothing, that's just a letter A. So without that instruction, you will keep moving as if you are in the right place. Because the experience is an experience that says keep going in the way you're going. Eventually you'll get there. You're on the right track. Then the card, once we've memorized it, says if you see the letter A, you're in the wrong place. So then we see the letter A and you go, oh, that's strange. I feel like I'm in the right place. And it depends on whether you remember what's on the card, whether you trust what's on the card, as to whether it's going to be enough of a guide to move you somewhere else. So in the teaching, so that was a metaphor or an analogy. So in the teaching, the equivalent of the card that says if you see a letter A in a yellow circle, you're in the wrong spot, the teaching says one's happiness is not to be found in outcomes. Your happiness is not dependent on outcomes, meaning happiness is available regardless of the circumstance, regardless of the outcomes. That means that if you are looking for your happiness in outcomes, just give me this. And if I get that, then everything will be okay. Whatever it is, life partner, more money, better social skills, whatever, more intelligence. More wisdom, peace of mind. If we're looking for salvation, happiness, and we think it will be in one of those things, we are misguided. We are thinking in a way that will keep suffering in place. That's what that card is saying. And it's the root of what keeps us seeking outward, which keeps us from turning inward. And we are very unlikely to see this error unless it's pointed out and unless it sinks in, at least on an intellectual level to start with. It's sinking in on the intellectual level is us remembering that the card says if you see the letter A, you're in the wrong place. So if we intellectually understand that, then it means when we see the letter A in a yellow circle, the intellectual understanding of the concept on the card will allow us to say, hey, I'm in the wrong spot because there's a letter A in a yellow circle. That means we have an intellectual understanding. It doesn't necessarily mean that we know deeply that is why that is true or why we're in the wrong spot. But that can come, the intellectual understanding can lead us to a deeper understanding that indeed I was in the wrong spot. As the intellectual understanding interferes with and gets us to function differently than we would if we didn't get this wake-up call. Your happiness is not to be found in outcomes. So then we have to ask, so what is my happiness? If it's not outcome-based. So first, I suppose we have to say outcomes are either pleasure or pain. All outcomes are going to be pleasurable or painful. What determines whether something is pleasurable or painful is how the outcome is in respect to our biological preferences, the body's biological preferences. So, if you find yourself on out in the midday sun and it is searing, the hottest day of the year, we can say that is the circumstance. The circumstance is that the temperature is 110 degrees Fahrenheit, 45 degrees Celsius, and that is hot. And we could say the biological preferences of the body are for the weather to be in the high 20s Celsius. I don't know, what 80 maybe in Fahrenheit. And so if the weather is not in that range, there is going to be a biological response that is pain, or at least relatively painful compared to if it was more in line with our preferences. And so if the outcome, the circumstance is in line with our preference, then instead of pain, biological pain being the response, there is biological pleasure. And pain and pleasure doesn't have to be simply physical. The example I used with the sun is one of physical pleasure or physical pain, but it can be to do with how a person speaks to you, how someone treats you, and that might be, let's say, emotional rather than physical. It can have to do with whether you lose money or make money, whether something costs a lot and is outside of your budget and is going to cause financial problems. And even if it doesn't cause financial problems, if something is broken, then you can say, oh, it's financial pain. And if you have a windfall, then you can say a financial windfall. You could say financial pleasure, because it is in line with your biological preferences or out of line with your biological preferences. So we can say that circumstance is all pleasure or pain, and the three categories that the teaching uses to encompass any circumstantial pleasure or pain is physical, emotional, or financial. Now, those labels are somewhat arbitrary. They've been chosen in the teaching because the teaching says they are 3 good labels to encompass the range of different circumstantial pleasure or pains. You could maybe come up with your own version of the different types of pleasure or pain. You may find that in retrospect you'll think, oh, well, the teachings categorizations are better, or it may in fact be that your categorizations turn out to be a better set of categorizations than the 3 used in the teaching. Now, the labeling of it, the categorization of it, is simply there to allow the cognition, to allow the working mind to start seeing that outcomes are pleasure or pain, and nothing other than pleasure or pain. And then for us to hopefully see that our attitude to that pleasure or pain is another movement that happens simultaneous to the outcome, and that is where the suffering exists on that level. Now, this dissolution of the psychological identity requires not only an understanding of the concept of non-doership, the concept of non-attachment. That's very important, but at some point the nature of the human, the nature of experience needs to be seen. Because if the nature of experience isn't seen, if our vision of experience stops at the gross aspects of the experience, which therefore tend to make us relate to the fact that we are experiencing a gross object, then that means that we know the world as a world of form only. That's as far as our perception will go, to see form, to see form as reality. And that means that we are unlikely to see the impermanence of not only form, physical form, but the more subtle types of form that make up the human experience. And the more subtle types of form would include emotion and thought. And the most subtle aspect that we could say is beyond the level of form and is very unlikely to be appreciated, or that there's very unlikely to be an awareness of the most subtle aspect of the human being, if we haven't gone past the previously mentioned aspects of form, like the physical form, the emotional form, and the thought form. If we haven't seen past that, then it's very unlikely that the most subtle aspect of the human being, consciousness, is going to be known. So what do I mean by the experience? The nature of experience needs to be appreciated. It's about awareness looking at what we could call life, which is really the experience of life, and asking questions about it, not just any questions, but the questions that tend to reveal its nature. So we tend to be prompted as to what questions to ask or what things to look for. And if our seeing is guided by these questions sufficiently, then we might start to realize that what we thought was the primal object, meaning an object that is not dependent on anything else, it just exists, and then we see it or we don't see it, we're looking at it or we're not looking at it, we're in the room with it or we're not in the room with it, but regardless of whether we're looking at it or in the room with it, it is independent and physical and has an independent, its own existence, which is frankly our relationship to the world, that the world is essentially a rock of mass, and it was here before we were born and will be there after we die. And that is the perception of experience that hasn't gone beyond form. Now, is there a perception of the nature of experience that can go beyond form? Is there such a thing? Can we go beyond form? And the suggestion is yes, because the form is not really form. It's an experience of form. Meaning, when we say, oh, the world is a rock, the earth is a rock, and people, buildings, trees, mountains, rivers exist independent of anything, and we die and they remain. That is based on an assumption that we know that which we are talking about, the river, the tree, the mountain. We have to know the mountain to have an opinion on the mountain. We have to have union or relationship with these things to be able to talk about them, right? The mountain will be there after I die. We must have at least walked on the mountain, or touched the mountain, or at least touched a mountain, such that when we see a picture of a mountain, we say that in principle that mountain is the same as the other mountain that I have had an experience of or know as a mountain. We might never have been on a mountain, snow-covered mountain, for example, but we say, well, I've been on a hill, and in principle they're sort of the same. Now, so we have a relationship with those objects that we are saying something about. But what if we only ever have a relationship that is a relationship with our experience of a tree, our experience of a mountain, of a rock, etc., etc. And so I think you'll all agree that you have an experience of your garden, for example, what we call your garden. And because the experience communicates a certain story, a certain set of aspects and features, we then conclude, oh, this is how the garden is. If you go to the fact that the experience of the garden may not be of an actual objective garden, or of an actual objective tree, or an actual objective other person. There's no doubt there is an experience of a tree, a flower, another person, a world of time and space. But how objective is that? How independent is the object from us. And if we inquire a certain way, we'll realize that our experience of life is never independent of that which is aware of the thing. That as soon as you take the one or the thing that is aware of the object away, in the experience, the object ceases to exist. Now, I'm not saying that there is or there isn't an actual object that ceases to exist. That's outside of I'm pointing to the fact that my experience, your experience, everyone's experience of life has only ever been an experience of something in the presence of that which is aware of that which is experienced. And so no one can confirm or deny that there is an actual objective something. Everyone only has their experience of life that is always an experience dependent on that which is aware of whatever there is awareness of. Now, it might seem like this is pedantics, this is mental acrobatics, trying to turn something into not something, trying to turn that which is into, well, maybe it doesn't exist, it's not real, etc., etc. I'm trying to be as real as I can, and pointing out that I have never experienced any object that I can talk about in the absence of the awareness that is aware of it. And so I can't say that anything exists independent of the awareness that is aware of it. I can't say that things don't have an existence independent of awareness that is aware of it, but I can say that in my experience, something only ever exists when there is awareness of it. And I'd suggest that that line is the line that is appropriate for anyone to hold. If someone were to say something contrary to that line, I think they'll find that there's a critical thinking glitch in what they're saying. Why is that important? It's important because it can be the bridge, the gateway for there to be an investigation of what the experience of life is and whether it actually is separate from what I am. And that sort of investigation can lead to a deconstructing of the very many layers of the experience of life we have, such that the layer of thought, the layer of physical sensation, and the various physical sensations, sight, sound, touch, smell, taste, etc., the layer of emotion, the layer of the working mind and the thinking mind as subsets of the layer of thought, all of those things can start to be seen as objects that arise in the present moment, if they happen to be in that present moment. You might have a present moment that includes no visual sense, or no sound sense, no thoughts, no emotions, because each moment is a unique moment and it doesn't necessarily include all of the possible objects or even all of the possible object type layers. Sometimes one of the object type layers is removed in a meditation, let's say, or when there is certain sensory deprivation. And that the capacity to deconstruct the present moment experience. So really what I'm talking about is awareness of the present moment experience in a curious way, in an inquiring way, will maybe lead to what might start off like a whole bundle of cotton threads all wrapped up and tightly knotted together, might lead to an unpicking of that bundle such that all the yellow threads can be seen for what they are, yellow threads, all the orange threads, all the red threads, all the blue threads, the black threads, the white threads, the grey threads. And so they are deconstructed, and then maybe we say, yes, but we're not meant to live a deconstructed experience. And so the tapestry of life can be reconstructed such that those threads then form the tapestry. They don't need to remain deconstructed. But we then know that what we are looking at, the tapestry, is actually made up of all of these threads that have been understood in their own right or experienced, meaning there was awareness of the different components that make up the each moment. And what we'll see in that exploration, if it's destiny for there to be awareness of these levels on the different levels of subtlety, is that the movement, the sense of self, or the sense of being a human, the thoughts are all movements in consciousness, and that they are not as real as we had previously related to them. That even the way we relate to life is in fact part of the movement in the present moment. It too is part of the tapestry. And so if we see that, the sense of being Roger with preferences is simply because in the particular moment pleasure or pain arises, and let's say there's a consistency to there being pleasure when certain foods are eaten or when certain activities are undergone, then and it's seen that pleasure is a movement in consciousness. If in that deconstructing the present moment, which really means bringing awareness to all of the components, and we then start to see that what I know or knew of as who I am is actually a coming and going, nothing more than a whole lot of movements in consciousness, which is not to say that we should then dismiss those movements in consciousness. They will continue. A lot of them are not problematic. And so Roger will have his preferences, have his particular characteristics, will have his way of thinking. But it will be known that the experience that Roger has of Roger is really simply a movement of these characteristics that don't have independent existence, but rather come and go in consciousness. When someone is feeling excited, it isn't that there is a consistent person and that consistent person experiences a range of emotions, excitement, sadness. That's the standard view, but we might come to see that Roger is the movement as it arises. So Roger is excited when excitement arises, and excitement is one of the threads amongst all the other threads, which includes the sense of the body. So that's a whole lot of threads, the physical sensation, the sense of touch, the placement of the body in the spatial aspect of what appears to be the world of form in the experience, and what was I talking about? Roger's excitement is not Roger as some unchangeable entity that gets excited, and is that Roger is born afresh in that moment as the arising of all of those characteristics in the present moment experience. And that is the same for all of us. So what we know ourselves as is really something that comes and goes. So dying to the moment, which is a suggestion in many spiritual teachings, we should die to the moment, which is a metaphor for letting go of what has happened, can really only happen if we see that the entity to whom apparently life happens is in fact not a consistent entity, but rather one that is being continually born afresh in each moment. Once that's seen, then the dying to each moment is a inevitability. It's a consequence of that seeing. Now, if the individual person continues to know themselves only as something that is permanent and objectively real, well, we don't really ever think of ourselves as really permanent, because we do believe at some point, most of us, that we're going to die. But that hasn't shown the real impermanence, the real impermanent nature, which is we die not after 90 years or 100 years or 40 years, but we die each second because we never existed other than an appearance in the present moment. And for this to be known, essentially, awareness has become aware of itself as the subtlest aspect of experience, but what we could say the most real or the fundamental aspect of experience. And from that point, all that is moving is seen to be simply a play, and nothing really happened. Not that we will live life experientially as if nothing happened, but attitudinally, psychologically, the movement that ordinarily arises when life is seen to be real and I know myself to be real, that will fall away. It doesn't make us... so the understanding that everything is an arising in consciousness, if it becomes too one-sided, is then not part of the paradox of life, and we'll find that it isn't only the psychological aspect that falls away. We will find that we essentially are bypassing the existence of the experience and dismissing the reality of the experience on a circumstantial level, which is essentially an overstepping of what I'm describing in today's satsang. And that often happens. It's part of a deepening into the realization that I don't really exist in the way that I previously thought that I existed. So when a teaching says you're not real, you don't exist, it's really saying you're not real, you don't exist in the way that you perceive yourself to be. We exist in the way we exist, which is in this moment, I exist as an appearance in the present moment, an experience in the present moment. But that's all part of the integration, and it looks after itself because there is no doer. So it too is a happening. So I wanted to put that in because when we talk about the bottom when we look at it from the bottom-up approach, which is the approach that says, let me not get too carried away with none of this is real, we can easily hear the bottom-up approach that talks about the human being and its preferences and circumstance and decisions and destiny. And that might be used to continue to reinforce the idea that the world is real as a physical only. So that the world, so it can be used to reinforce the view that the physical is the only thing. And there is this other side of the coin. Remembering there are two sides of the coin, and at some point they become balanced, which means understanding that it's not real doesn't mean it is completely not real. At some point we say, but we have to live life as if it is real, because that's what life is. Life is not, even after liberation, is not meant to be a life where the character goes around denouncing life, saying, hey, do you know this isn't real? That's not real. The car doesn't exist. I don't exist. That wouldn't be living as if it is real. So at some point, we just carry on living life as the character, allowing life to live us, allowing life to unfold as it always has done, which means we essentially embody being human, not looking for anything outside of here. Say, well, that'll at death, that will take care of needing to worry about or to play this role. But until that point comes, this is all there is. So I'm going to get on living life. And at that point, the suffering might not be something that arises in that life lived. So we have some hands up. See John at the top of the list. Just 1 second, let's turn the sound on. John, can you hear me?
My name is Kavya.
Oh, hello, Kavya.
That is John, my husband's website.
Okay. Hi, Kavya.
So, Roger, I'm from Australia. I grew up in Melbourne, and it's amazing that I left Australia to get help. And lo and behold, here's Roger from Australia giving me my main help. Go figure. So, Roger, I recently came across your website. And so I want to, in a nutshell, let you know my interpretation of what you said, to make sure, as a perfectionist, that I get it right. So I wrote it down so I wouldn't get lost. I've been studying Advaita Vedanta, which is wonderful. So I started from the top, and now I'm at the bottom, which feels more valuable in a sense. And when I clicked onto your website and heard your talk, I was overjoyed and wanted to hear it over and over. My understanding, my goal is to be happy in day-to-day living. I did not choose my parents. The sperm and eggs got together. Being a fetus, growing, not my doing. Being born, and the death of my mother, and being told I was ugly and stupid at 2 years old and onwards. Not my fault that my mother died. emotional abuse, neglected, left Australia. So choices made based upon the biological makeup and up-to-date conditioning, not my doing. I'm so happy to understand this and to hear this. And when I heard it, I was being the doer because I couldn't get enough. I wanted to make sure I got it right, having suffered with OCD from abuse. So it seemed to have tapped in. Enough said. I want to make sure that what I said is right so that I can now have this absolutely ingrained belief system drop like a hotcake.
Mm-hmm.
And being understanding that life in day-to-day living does not mean that the outcome is happiness. To accept what is, to be in the limitless conscious awareness self,
Mm-hmm.
that is the observer, and sit back in being and let go.
I think you have hit the nail on the head.
Namaste. Thank you. Because one more thing, to understand that I am this spiritual being having a human condition, somehow did not. It was intellectual, even though I've had a lot of counseling to go back to crawling and because I didn't get that. But to hear you talk this fundamental experience in this life, in addition to knowing who I am, is amazing.
Mm. Yeah.
Thank you, Roger.
You're very welcome. I'm glad that it had that effect. I think that if someone has come from the top-down approach and they've found the space of awareness open up where they can rest in being, that's a gift. However, I think it needs a balancing power at some point, or a shift in focus from the emphasis that starts off being it's all about awareness of self, and that is very significant, it's very important, and so there's merit, there needs to be that focus, but at some point that works, or that's delivered, and then the focus needs to be on something more practical, because you could spend a whole lifetime where it is all about self, and then the aspects that and there can be an awakening to the subtle aspect of self, but then the aspects that lead to suffering may never get addressed, and I think a lot of the feedback from seekers that have been seeking in non-dual circles for many years and actually have found profound shifts happening, have made comments similar to yours. It says, well, this was the missing piece, because the teachings I was immersed in never talked about that. They were always talking about, I am that, essentially, and they have to. So that isn't a criticism of that. That's what they have to keep hammering that home in order to create that awakening. And then it's grace for someone to come across and for it to resonate, for something different to come in. Not that it doesn't invalidate the other at all, it supports the other. And so I think Ramesh his guru was Nisargadatta, and Nisargadatta's most well-known collection of works is in the book I Am That. And Ramesh said if it was up to him, he would have renamed the book. I don't think he really meant that. I think he was trying to make a point. And he would have renamed it I Am That, Living as This. That doesn't make the pointers to I am that, where the teachings are pointing to you are not this, you are that. It doesn't make them invalid. They have to be there to awaken us to the subtle aspect, which we at first will call that. There'll be an awakening to that, or that which is referred to as that, where we might say, I know God, I am an aspect of God. Then at some point it needs to become practical, where that understanding of the formless essence of self comes back down to daily living, and then the patterns of suffering that haven't yet been dissolved through those other teachings can then be looked at and dissolved with the benefit of being grounded in self. And if we're not grounded in self, there's only so much of the patterns of doership and attachment that can be dissolved. But which way we come at it from is going to be different for everyone. You'll have some people that find the doership aspects and the attachments aspects being dissolved, and then that at some point that leads to the realization of self. So it doesn't really matter what each individual person's particular path is, but the truth of the matter is that both sides need to be focused on eventually.
So you think I got it, Roger? Did I make sense? Being obsessive and a doership right now, but just need to hear. Do you think I understand? Did I get your teaching right thus far?
Yes, what you described is correct, but let me also point out why it's particularly, you got it particularly right for you, because my guess is, based on what you've shared, that there has been a load of shame, guilt and shame, that has been carried around and has formed a large part of the psychological identity, whether you realize it or not. So I am the one. Yeah, so in that cycle, I am the one that is not good enough, that is not according to the concepts that were delivered, the conditioning. I am not pretty enough, or whatever, smart enough, and then that becomes how we know ourselves, and we're continually trying to make ourselves enough. And this, the concept that hit for you is saying, if we believe we're not enough, we're then going to need to become enough. If the principle beneath our assumption of not being enough is uprooted, the whole idea on which we assess ourselves as and believe the assessment of others falls away, because it's like, oh, I am, and everyone is exactly as they are meant to be, exactly as they are destined to be. So, if someone is born with a leg growing out of their head, who did that? Now, the person could feel shame at the fact that they have a leg growing out of their head. But the shame says, I did this. I mustn't have done it well enough. And the thing is that, it's a bit of an extreme example, but if someone's born without an arm, for example, they didn't do that. That was just how all of the forces of the universe came together. And so then this idea of not good enough can subside, and that's why it's so valuable to have a grounding in the sense of self, because that false sense of self can collapse, and that's when we get to appreciate that which is perfect, as in that which is complete already, which is on the layer of the silent awareness, the formless consciousness. It is self-confirming. If we rest there, then all of these mental movements subside.
So now, in closing, I can rest there because I know the choices I made based upon the biological and the conditioning could not have been otherwise.
Absolutely.
So now I will be able to be being and rest in my true nature.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for dropping in.
Thank you.
So, Angie, I think, Hi, Angie.
Hello. Hello, Roger. Hello, everyone. So I have a general a question about non-duality, and maybe I don't know how to explain it, but to me right now it seems that I can summarize non-duality with the words everything can go. So, anything is possible. Anything is possible at any time to anyone. If there's anything that your mind can think of that, may happen to anyone somewhere, or it will happen, or it has happened. So basically everything goes. And we are trying to see our own experience, because this is all we have from these lenses. And you clearly define this framework that helps one kind of see everything in a way that brings the end of suffering, what they experience in their own lives. To me, sometimes some of these concepts might seem like they're stepping on each other's toes. And I find the umbrella that brings everything together is whatever happens is God's will. So you can kind of always fall back onto that part of the framework that says it's God's will.
Mm-hmm.
So we are trying to apply, for instance, speakers last week, they talked about the fact that it's easy to accept, let's say, non-doership in hindsight, or partially apply some of the concepts when it comes to easier decisions. But when you're in a whirlpool of life and some more important decisions come up, it's more difficult to apply some of these concepts. So let's say, for instance, shoulds and shouldn'ts, trying to not be attached to outcome. So if you are placed in a position where you have to take a decision, what's considered a major decision in life. Should I go this way or the other way? And I find that is difficult because isn't that decision making an attachment to outcome? Of course, the natural movement of the biological mind is to move towards pleasure. But isn't that the form of attachment? And maybe sometimes we don't have this, we don't have this luxury of making decisions. We're kind of pushed in one direction, and then, you feel like you're left without that opportunity to really make a decision. And then you have to apply the other concept in the framework that says everything is God's will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So who is trying not to be attached to outcomes? For example, in making a decision, there is someone trying not to be attached to outcomes. What if it is God's will for there to be attachment to outcomes? So if there is a surrendering to the fact that everything is happening, then even if there is attachment to outcomes, then there will be a surrendering to the fact it's God's will for there to be attachment to outcomes. If it's understood that it's all God's will, then the decision, whether it feels like your decision or whether it feels like you are pushed into a decision because, I don't know, you miss the deadlines for certain things, and so therefore the decision gets made for you. Whichever it is, it's all God's will. So attachment to outcome is not, I would like, I would like the cheaper airfares, so let me buy those ones, right? We might say, that's attachment to outcome, isn't it? I would like the cheaper airfares. That's a biological preference to prefer the cheaper airfare than the more expensive one. Let's say the limited number of cheap tickets. It's the same flight, same stopovers, etc. The attachment to outcome is if you don't get the cheap tickets because there's they get sold out. Attachment to outcome happens then after you don't get them, or if you do get them, where you feel that is where your happiness lies, then it means that there is an involvement in that outcome that we would call attachment to outcome. But life itself is always going to be about outcomes. So, and life is always going to be about making decisions, which are not you making a decision. It's a decision happening according to God's will. That's always going to be the case, and we're always going to make decisions in line with our preference. The body isn't going to make a decision that is out of line with its preference. That wouldn't make any sense. It's not going to decide, I want to pay the expensive price, when the cheap price that gives you exactly the same thing is available. That would be the biological organism malfunctioning if it were to decide to pick an option that is not its preference. So we must understand that a lot of decisions, when attachment to outcome falls away, will be guided by our biological preference. That means there will be a movement towards pleasure and away from pain. However, the attachment to outcome is where we are not insistent on that being my happiness and not insistent on pleasure being delivered all the time, because we understand that the flow of life is a mix of sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain.
And this morning, today, you also spoke about making mistakes, so finding yourself in the wrong place. And I was wondering how does that fit in with everything is God's will? I mean, can we really make any mistakes ever if it's all God's will?
No, can we
really be in the wrong place?
Well, that's the paradox, and that's where that's where our peace of mind lies, is where we can say, I made a mistake in the sense that, I went to the wrong terminal in the airport. So relative to where my plane was meant to take off, we can say, I made a mistake, I went to the wrong place. Understanding that that was destiny, and so it was only wrong relative to that catching that plane, but it was destiny for that mistake to happen, for you not to catch the plane. And so that's where we can acknowledge, for example, I made a mistake on the relative level, but not turn it into guilt or shame. And when I say not turn it into guilt or shame, that if that happens, that is because God's will is for the story of Angela to be one free of suffering, and yet still inclusive of pain from time to time. So you could find that missing your plane, even though it is God's will, is painful relative to your preference of catching the plane. In most cases, if a painful circumstance happens, suffering very quickly follows. Why is this happening? How could I have gone to the wrong place? And a sense that now that I've missed my plane, life isn't worth living. Very temporarily, maybe. That is what is experienced internally. Like, this is not okay. If the layer of suffering has been is destined not to arise, then there is the pain of missing the plane, but the internal groundedness that says, I exist. Right here, this is where I'm meant to be. This is, I still am. I haven't been diminished by the fact that the outcome of being in that place is not going to happen.
And the paradox for me sometimes is that using this concept of it's all God's will feels like a bit of a bypassing, and gives me sometimes a feeling of guilt. Because, I let that happen. Maybe I could have done it differently. But it's God's will, so I'm okay. But I'm really not okay because there's that little thing inside that says, aren't you just using this as an excuse? Or
yeah, you see, that's why I think the paradox of being able to call a mistake on a relative level is important, where someone would say, no, you see, there is no mistake. That's where you're going wrong, is you're saying that it was a mistake. And there is no mistake. There is only God's will, and you were destined to go to the wrong place, and so don't call it a mistake. And that tends to be the movement when we're coming to appreciate the different way of looking at it. We can sort of swing to one side, because as we're learning, let's say, that it's all God's will and opening up to that, as soon as we say it's a mistake, it might take us back into shame. As soon as we say it's a mistake on any level, then so we learn to say there's no such thing as mistake. It's all God's will. Now, when you do that, which is part of the process, what is happening is there is a bypassing of the relative level. And on the relative level, things get learnt. If we are to say it's all God's will, just as a sort of overarching, where in hindsight it's stepped over the balance point, then there is the sense that maybe this is bypassing could be accurate, and that in due course we'll come back and maybe be able to hold it's God's will. Yes, so no point feeling regret and blame and all of that, because that's not beneficial. But let me call a spade, which is I made a mistake in processing the information that said gate 3 when in fact it was gate 8. So let me not overlook the fact that it's not my mistake, because the processing of gate 3 as gate 8 or gate 8 as gate 3 happened inside the cognition, which is a very complex thing, and it happened. But let's say that on a practical level, that's why the plane was missed, because that mistake was made. Or if we change it to, we got to the airport too late because we didn't leave early enough from home. If we just say it's God's will, we won't learn. If we say it's God's will, so I'm not going to feel guilt and shame, but we're able to still analyze the situation, we next time might leave an hour earlier.
So I find all these paradoxes challenging to hold at the same time, right? Like even this a paradox of evolution and learning, versus reality being instantaneously created moment by moment.
Well,
even though, yeah.
In fact, the process is not really one of holding the paradox from the outset. If we held the paradox from the outset, or if we try to hold the paradox from the outset, our brain, our cognition doesn't work that way. That's why the teachings, the teachings actually often don't treat it as two sides of a coin. They will say that is not reality, that is ignorance, and that is reality. So in certain teachings, and many teachings, it'll be, that is illusion and that is truth. At some point, when the paradox comes in, we'll find that what was previously being called illusion is both real and unreal. And what is being called truth is both real and unreal. But in order for that to happen, we first need to see what is being called truth. And in order for us to see what is being called truth, which is really both real and unreal, and the other is both real and unreal, in order for us to see what is called truth, the other has to be labeled as untrue. That's the ultimate duality, actually, when you look at it. Truth and untruth. And ironically, though, that is how we come to see what we haven't seen, is through the teachings, creating the ultimate duality. And then at some point, after that, an integration happens where the paradox sets in and can be held comfortably, but that that can't happen prematurely, because if it happens prematurely, it will interfere with the grounding into that which we haven't seen.
Yeah, because we have a layer of existence where we live our lives, like current experience and, you know, what is our perceptions. But even when we think in terms of the physical world, there's various layers. There's the vastness of the universe, where we're just like a speck of dust. The whole planet is like a speck of dust. And, you know, we also have the quantum reality. We know it's here, but it's on a different layer. You know, even our body is a host for a lot of other microorganisms. So we are a whole universe for them. So I feel like we have to find the balance where we are, kind of, and
yes, I agree. It's there isn't. I don't think there is an ultimate truth. The understanding eventually is to see that there are all these different perspectives and layers from which, when it's seen from that layer, you would describe it this way. When it's seen from this layer, you describe it that way, and that they are not opposing, even if they sound very different. They are just the same thing being described from different angles. And, you know, we previously would have taken one of the angles as the truth and looked at a description from a different angle and said, oh, that's ignorance. And eventually we will say, oh no, there is no thing as a single truth, other than in the manifestation, the impersonal sense of I am, because the impersonal sense of I am means you drop all talking and concepts and drop into being, and that is what is said to be the truth in the manifestation, because it is outside of relative concepts, and it is self-confirming, and even that in a way is simply a pointer to something that is very important, an aspect that we tend not to be aware of. So even saying that the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am is a concept.
Because that's the point through which we see everything, we experience everything, I suppose. You could concentrate that into a point, kind of.
Yeah, and if you rest there, you can. It's essentially a way of saying to be with what is, without there being any labeling that can cause a separation between you and what is. And so no psychological resistance to what is, because you drop into I am, and if you have a leg growing out of your head because that's something that happened genetically, you drop into I am, and in I am there isn't any self-referencing or thinking about the leg growing out of your head. You just
anything goes, basically. Yeah, it's just like you floating alone in an empty space, and you're the perfect thing in that space, right?
Yes, yeah, there is nothing missing and nothing needs to be added, and all is well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'll talk to Holger and Harleen, but I think we'll have trouble addressing any more questions after that. I also wanted to mention I finally got around to updating the website for the next two events that are happening. One is the 3-week retreat in Australia in October and November. And before that, there is a 6-day online intensive at the end of April, the 25th of April, I think it is. So if anyone is interested in those events, the registration is on the website, and it's now available, whereas it wasn't previously, as some of you know, because I've been getting some messages. Holger, hello.
Hello, Roger.
Hi.
Hi. I just want to express my gratitude for this beautiful teaching and your unending creativity of putting words onto the unnameable. I mean, it's fascinating. And I can feel the reality of it, the truth of all those pointers, how they all come back to simply being myself. How simple. I mean, your words, sometimes you make me feel dizzy. Like today, when you, at one point, it's just so much talking. But on one level, it's perfect. And I just want to say thank you. And it's amazing. It's, yeah.
You're very welcome. And thank you for making me chuckle.
Yeah. Yesterday, I spoke with a friend on Zoom, and I just allowed myself to say stop when she went into the story and into, because it's so easy for mind to deviate, to just, it's so fascinating for me to see, I believe I see so much how the hunger of the separate self to always justify its own misery. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, that's the only place it knows to feel alive, I guess. It feels like that's where it gets its sustenance from, but in fact it's not very fulfilling. So it's nice to be able to see that that's the pattern.
So there needs to be the willingness to die on one level.
Yes, which is
psychologically.
The willingness is really another way of saying that is whether it's if the fear is too strong, then dying doesn't happen. You could say, because all the escape routes will be run towards. So a willingness to die, it's in a way it's consequential. If everything lines up and the fear is just at that point where it doesn't push us to running away, then or maybe a whole lot of other things, certain insights happen, or all of the exit points are blocked off, or whatever, then dying in that moment, or willingness to die, can happen. So even the willingness is not so much our will. But yes, in the moment, we will see, today there was a willingness to die. Yesterday there wasn't. Maybe it could be. So if you're right. Yeah.
But it's a paradox, because on one level, this is life itself. It's love itself. I mean, what I feel is, what I believe to be fear, is love itself wanting to embrace me.
You said fear, right? Is love itself?
Fear. Yes. What I interpreted from the standpoint of being a separate self, it feels like fear. But on another level, it's love.
Well, yes, because I guess without that fear, we would not be moved.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm glad that it's music to your ears.
Just deep gratitude, and on a practical level, a paradox for me is still money, to charge for things. But I guess, I assume, I know that this also will become clear over time, maybe. Because on one level, I see life is so generous. I mean, the best things are free. And maybe I'm just afraid of being selfish, but a different topic. I don't want to deviate here. It's just some blah blah right now.
It is a different topic, but in brief, I would say that we usually have an issue with things like people charging for their services, etc. Not because there's a problem with that, but because there is an attachment to outcomes, and in such a situation, the attachment to outcome is probably because, let's say, the person's financial situation or their relationship to money is where the attachment lies, and often that is because money is not all the time, but often. So I don't know if it's where your situation is, but if someone has a tight financial situation in life where they are essentially having to choose what they can have because they don't have enough money for everything, and then if someone charges something, there is the fact someone is charging them is in a way saying, well, sorry, you can't have this, because they don't have enough money for it. And so then that is received as pain, that they can't have it, and it's seen to be because it's being charged for. And so once that dynamic is in place, then there is a whole identity around money, and then that can present itself in different forms or in different areas. For, let's say, you might be talking about charging for your own services, and that might not be clear. You might have trouble charging for your services because earlier on there might have been this dynamic around money that has been put in place linked to pain, which is then turned into something that determines your completeness and whatever. So then you might say, well, if I charge, I am doing that to someone else. You're not, what you might be doing is delivering pain to them, but pain is not an attack on who they are. It isn't a diminishment of themselves. It isn't taking their happiness away. Whereas if we have a relationship to pain of not being able to have something and say this is an attack on who I am, then we're going to find it very hard to charge people, because we're going to feel like we're taking something fundamental away from them. So usually someone who has a resistance, if there is a resistance to money, because that is the system we have, that's how the world goes around, it often is because there is attachment around the topic. But you're right, so many things in life are free and beautiful things.
And thank you for offering this teaching and your satsangs. It's more precious than gold. Again. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Olga. A comment just before I go to Harleen. A comment that I wanted to make, because when a topic comes up in the media, like war, like the incident that happened between Will Smith and Chris Rock, everyone has an opinion, and the opinion tends to be a judgment of whether it is good or bad, who was right, who was wrong, and an involvement in the circumstance. And I think that if we get to see life differently from outside, where we understand that circumstance can be anything, and it will be according to, one way of saying it is, God's will or destiny. And if we have an explanation of what dynamics that God's will has put in place on a causal level to bring about the outcomes that are God's will. So, for example, we will function according to God's will, but we will function according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. So more specifically than God's will, we can say, I function according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning, which is God's will, because God's will put in place the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So if we see life like that, then we don't need to say, oh, well, I don't think this should have happened, or he's right or he's wrong. We tend to then no longer need to be polarized, but rather look at the situation and understand, well, that happened because of, let's say, genes and up-to-date conditioning is one. And then if we dig deeper, we could say, there might be some anger issues, let's say. Now, they're just a subset of genes and up-to-date conditioning. So if you see someone getting angry, we don't need to judge whether the anger is right or wrong, but we can say, oh, they're getting angry because of the design, because of God's will. God's will, yes, but it can seem a bit esoteric. If we just look at, say, he got angry, he got violent because of the genes and up-to-date conditioning and the particular circumstance might have been under pressure or particularly emotionally vulnerable that day or whatever, which doesn't say it's okay. It just says, oh, it happened because of a whole lot of whatever the circumstances or the particulars led to that. And so I was commenting earlier on that it's great to be able to look at things and instead of judge them as should it or shouldn't it have happened, we can look at it and say, oh, this is what is playing out. We can say that for any situation, including the very sad, let's say there's some specific cruelties going on. We could say that that is the movement of that particular person, psychological structures that are moving in this way, creating that cruelty, which doesn't make the cruelty less cruel, but it makes it more understandable. And that means that we're in less resistance with life when we understand not so much why, but understand at the end of the day, yes, it is happening. And that's how it happened. So then we can say that's how it was destined to happen. Anyhow, that was a little side note. Harleen, hi.
Hi, Roger. Thanks for taking the question.
No problems.
after listening to various satsangs, both you and lockdown, I can probably see that how any issue is not as important as it seems to be. And I just had this one question, but ultimately we all have to, we are that living as this, right? So just that there's this one trouble that I see myself having, and it's to do with, but then also you said like in the beginning that there is a place from which you are telling us that there is no past. And what is that place where someone is saying that to us? That's the trouble that I have is in like, say, like a friendship, getting my head around that the friendship has to exist the way it has existed, let's say, for a decade, but say like things were said to each other and permanent damage has been done to the friendship and it just can't exist the way it has existed.
Mm-hmm.
But probably it can, like, so say we can like not have, the friend and I cannot like take trips together, for example. Yeah, and but because of some common ground, we can like say maybe just meet over a cup of coffee, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
But then, like, you know, very easily like get off the seat and be like, no way, like, you know, this isn't what it was.
Mm-hmm.
Rather it just not be. That's what maybe spirituality is all about, you know, existing, knowing that one can exist without a relation. But I think I'm taking that statement more aggressively.
You're taking the statement, what, sorry?
I think that I'm taking that statement with a certain level of aggression. Like, you know, that no, let's say, let's not even have the cup of coffee to exist. Like, you know, let's.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that easily could be a sort of a response to being hurt, and then sort of saying, well, I'm going to take this away. If I can't have that, then I'll take this away. The reality is that loss is a big part of life, and lost friends, you know, where something happens and a friendship comes to an end, something that you can feel sad about for an extended period of time, is normal. And so when I say sad, the question then is there attachment where it turns into suffering or not? And it doesn't have to be. It's, you know, I can think of friendships that ended a certain way, and it's sad, but it's life. The fact that maybe things were said, you could say, well, you know, that's what caused the problem, and you can look at it, it was said in the heat of the moment, it happened, and there's no point in really in regretting it. You can see it, yes, that was the catalyst for the friendship breaking down. So you can be objective about it and say, that I said things that I didn't really mean, or I don't feel that way, but in the moment they came out. So this happens, and then the friendship could break down in a way where it doesn't repair itself, and it really does come down to whether you know yourself experientially, such that the perfection, the completeness, the self-contentedness still exists even in the face of that loss. And yes, spirituality is pointing at the self that continues to exist in a content way, even in the face of the loss of something precious, even when that thing that is lost, that was precious, was lost because of the actions that happened through us, that in hindsight we look up and say, well, that was the catalyst. So even with that full set of variables, where it would be extremely easy for there to be attachment to outcome, one, because the precious friendship has been lost, and two, because it seems like it makes a lot of sense to feel guilt and shame, having acted or said what was said. They're very easy for the suffering to come in, and yet there is the potential for that not to happen. I can't hear you.
Okay.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Okay. So you have this intensive coming up in April. I sort of know what you mean by critical thinking in context that you share with us, but just the word integration there, that sort of makes me think if I should sign up for it or not, because we are not the body, and all that there is this formless awareness of such sort of things have not happened with me. So I'm not sure integration of
yeah, well, it started off being aimed at, I guess, seekers that have had awakening into the formless, and then talking about how we then need to see the other side of the coin and all of that. But in fact, I changed the topic a little bit after initially setting it at that. And I think, frankly, the critical thinking and the integration is something that happens all the way through. So there is always an integration of whatever insights has happened previously. And talking about critical thinking in the context of the teaching is not something we do that much. And I think there's, and still the main focus is going to be peace of mind and non-doership. It's just that the integration and critical thinking will be woven into that. So I think that there'll be something for everyone. So everyone is welcome to join that. But once again, I think you rely on moving not based on a should or a shouldn't, but wait to see what the impulse is. And if there's an impulse to sign up, then sign up. And if there isn't, then don't. And if the time comes and goes and signing up hasn't happened, then you can say, oh, well, it's destiny for me not to be part of that intensive. And similarly, if you sign up, then it's destiny for you to be part of it. And the outcome as to whether afterwards one is happy one signed up or one feels like it was a waste of time or money, that is out of our control.
We have been sharing these intensives for over a year. The first one that I signed up was for the energetic blocks one.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't sign up for the earlier ones. I wasn't listening. But now that I have, I just wanted to make sure that I take the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, I think there'll be something, plenty for everyone. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.